Welcome to Kicks and Minivans, the podcast for dads who love sneakers. I'm your host, KG. However you're watching and listening, man, we are glad you are here. Thank you for taking the time to hang out with us, join us today. We hope you have been enjoying the content lately. It has been heavy, it's been deep, the last two episodes, and today we are jumping into talking about mental health. And I love one of our guests. We have two guests on today. They are co-hosts of the Embrace Mental Health podcast, and I'm very excited. These guys are brilliant. This guy and this gal. So it is our first female guest outside of my wife coming on from time to time. But Wes and Kelsey co-host the Embrace Mental Health podcast together, and they are absolutely brilliant. They have a great understanding of this field, and I love one of the things Wes says in this interview is that mental health is a spectrum, and so no matter where you fall on that spectrum, mental health is something that affects us all, and some of us we really struggle with this, some of us we feel like we're in a very good place in our mental health, but no matter where you are, it is a spectrum. We all fall on that spectrum somewhere. But this is an area where I feel like, especially as guys, we just don't have the freedom to talk about a whole lot. And so very excited to have Wes and Kelsey come on and join us for this episode. I think you guys are going to love it. I think you're going to get so much out of it. So let's jump in right now. Well, Kelsey and Wes, welcome to Kicks and Minivans. Thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, good to be with you.
I was mentioning, this is Kelsey, outside of my wife, is the first female guest that we have had on Kicks and Minivans, so you should feel super honored right now.
I do.
In a podcast to help men win in marriage and parenting, we got our first female guest here in the second season. I am pumped about that, and Wesley here as well. Why don't you guys take a second? Ladies first, just introduce yourself, give us a little rundown of who you are, what you do.
All right. My name is Kelsey, and I am actually an assistant athletic director at the same high school that I graduated from, and I also coach volleyball and basketball, so I'm very much into sports, so I can definitely have a lot of respect for the sneakers aspect of things. Gotta love your tennis shoes, man.
Come on. Come on.
I don't know that I've ever felt like more of an imposter in my life. I mean, it's a little bit, a little far, but I am a single female. So who better to have on your podcast for,
helping men win in marriage.
Yeah. but yeah,
we do have some single guys that listen to this.
Right.
Some single dads and single childless men that are just preparing for that lifestyle, so
yeah, maybe that's the next step in online dating is meeting through podcasts. I don't know.
Meeting through podcast hosting. We could start something here, There
we go. But yeah, I'm also the host of the Embrace podcast, and have to give a lot of credit to Kevin. When I was thinking about doing this, I was like, who do I know that has a podcast? I was like, oh, I can ask Kevin, and you helped us get going and gave us a lot of great tips and hints and stuff, so appreciate it. Yeah,
happy to do it. I asked someone else when I was getting started. I was like, who do I know? And it was
Yep.
Chuck. There was a friend Chuck that I was like, hey, let me hit up Chuck, he has a podcast. So we just pass it along. We pass the info
there
along.
Go,
that's
yep.
it.
Someday someone will be asking you, Kelsey, I know she has a podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, well,
Wes, tell us about you.
Yeah, my name is Wes. Wesley, either one is good. And I am a therapist. I actually just started working full-time in my private counseling practice here in Mount Clemens, Michigan. And I see people in person and on telehealth across the state. And before this, I was a grief counselor at a large not-for-profit hospice. And so I've got a lot of experience grief counseling from that. And I was kind of doing both part-time while I was getting the practice off the ground. And now I'm full-time trying to get the practice off the ground. So, and I am a husband. I am a father of 2 kids currently, one more due at the very end of February, I was just telling Kevin. So that's very exciting. And That is most of my life. Any young fathers out there know
Oh
is
yes.
especially if you're working full time, it's like you got work, you got your family, and whatever else you can squeeze in. Maybe a little bit of a hobby, maybe a little bit of vacations and stuff. But that's what I got going on.
And he decided to co-host a podcast.
And I am
So,
the co-host of
because
the
he
Embrace
didn't
Mental
have
Health
enough to do.
podcast. Yeah,
He
yeah.
didn't have enough to do.
But
So,
yeah, emphasis on the co and co-host.
yeah,
It's
that was
Kelsey's show.
There's Kelsey started it, and then
Yeah.
Wes and another Autumn, correct?
Mhm.
Autumn,
Are co-hosting with them and sharing that load. And so definitely you'll hear more about Embrace Mental Health podcast throughout this episode, but definitely go check them out. I am a huge fan so far, and it's helping me a lot in my journey. Wes, let me ask you first. Do you, as a family of 4, soon to be 5, do you drive a minivan?
I drive a mini. We have 2 vehicles, and one is a minivan and one is a Prius. So it doesn't get more,
I'll take
classic
it.
dad than that. Yep.
Yes, that's exactly it. Our second car is not a Prius. I call it the Cruiser. It's this
Uh-huh.
little Kia that's not worth much, but it only has 90,000 miles and gets like 35 miles to the gallon. And so
That's the thing.
that's
That is
our,
the ideal
that's our Cruiser
combination.
right now.
That's right.
Yes.
The minivan is the utility vehicle for trips and for hauling the kids. And then the other one is just the best gas mileage, the most reliable. That's all you need. Yeah.
We never shared vehicles. We always had her vehicle and my vehicle until we had kids and got the minivan.
Mhm.
And now it's like whoever's watching the kids or primarily responsible for the kids at that time takes the minivan and the other takes the Cruiser.
That's right.
No matter what we're doing. And so
they are both
we
your
share
cars.
vehicles. We share the vehicles more than we ever have in this season. What kind of minivan do you have?
We have a 2012 Honda Odyssey.
The Honda Odyssey.
Honda
You got
Odyssey.
the cream of the crop.
We're loving it, man. It was tough to find. There are not a lot of minivans for sale around here, and rightly so. The ones who taste and see cannot untaste and cannot unsee, and they understand that the minivan is the ultimate type of vehicle, and it is the best kept secret. In fact, I think that the notion that they are not cool actually helps those who understand that they're actually the coolest, as far as function goes. Anyway.
This man. He does not have a master's degree for no reason. All right. This man. Oh, this is gonna be a great episode. I feel it.
Yeah.
All right.
Love the Odyssey.
It was actually brought to my attention that we don't talk about minivans enough on the Kicks and Minivans podcast. Like, we're talking about kicks, we talk about sneakers, but it has been brought to my attention that people would like to hear about minivans more. So now I'm like, I'm gonna assume, Kelsey, that you don't drive a minivan.
No, I don't need a minivan for me and my dog.
Nope.
But I will say, I went
on
on
how big your dog is, maybe.
I went on a road trip with a friend. We flew out to Colorado and then rented a van because she was bringing back some furniture from some family out there. And we were believers by the end. I mean, I don't really have a use for a van at this point, but we loved that mom van. We named her mom van, although I suppose dad van. It's just no hate here. Everybody can have a van, but
as long as van is in the name.
Yeah.
It was before we were ever pregnant. We me and a group of my volunteers, when I was on staff at a church, we flew down to Atlanta for the Orange Conference and rented a minivan because we had 5 adults. And I was driving that thing around for a week, and I was like, yo, I am getting one of these one day. Like, I didn't have kids yet. We weren't pregnant yet. Like, I was just like, dude, I'm in love with this. Like, I'm getting one of these as soon as I can. As soon as I can get one, I'm going in for it because it is like a luxury vehicle.
Right. All the things you want a car to do. Yeah. All the things you want a vehicle to do. It just has it's optimized for it. That's what it's for.
Yes.
It's an appliance in the best sense of the word. It's there to do a job.
It is the most practical vehicle ever built.
Yep.
It's just the most functional, practical vehicle ever built. All right. Let's talk sneakers for a minute. Either of you guys into sneakers? Kelsey, you mentioned a little bit with the sports stuff, but what are some shoes that you guys are wearing? What do you like?
I think if I had more money, I'd be more of a sneakerhead because I do like tennis shoes and whatever, but I don't have the money to be a true sneakerhead, I feel like. But,
that is a valid.
But as an athletic director and an athletics coach, not all tennis shoes are created equal. And so I try to wear my sneakers as much as I can. They're so much more comfortable than most other women's shoes, especially. And they're versatile, especially I'm always on the move at my job too. And so having good shoes is important.
Yeah.
It's also a very Midwestern thing to call them tennis shoes.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, it was always, growing up on the East Coast, it was always sneakers for me. My wife called them tennis shoes.
Okay. Yep.
And then I had a job at Dick's Sporting Goods selling sneakers, and people would come in like, I'm looking for tennis shoes. I'm like, okay, tennis shoes? Like for tennis?
For tennis?
Because like we have those, or just like regular shoes, So we had to specify. But that's a very Midwestern thing, I feel like.
Pop and soda, but the shoes version.
Yes, exactly that. Wesley, what about you?
You say kicks and people know what you're talking about.
There you go.
Yeah,
this is true.
So I am a minimalist man when it comes to my wardrobe. And so I have one pair of tennis shoes, and I like the classic basic white tennis shoes. So I've got some white Adidas Stan Smiths with a little bit of navy on the back. And yeah,
you
so
didn't
I like
say
those.
the Nike Monarch. So,
No,
like
we're
I like the Stan Smiths though. Those are classic. You can wear them with anything.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think my favorite major sportswear brand has to be Adidas, even though I have a lot of respect for Nike. So, but actually these days I am really into barefoot shoes. Have you ever heard of barefoot shoes or zero drop shoes?
No.
Okay. That's a whole
those
podcast
the ones with, like,
episode.
the toes?
The toe box is a little bit wider. Okay. And basically the idea is that, the way that shoes are today have to do with what was stylish like 100 years ago. And it kept on getting evolved for style. And then the style would mess with the way that we walk. And so we needed more support to sort of offset that. And that changed the way that we walk. And so barefoot shoes are shoes that are designed around the way that our feet are designed to work, the way that to walk, the way that kids walk, the way that people in tribal cultures walk. And so it's a whole thing. So yeah, the toe box is a little wider. There's basically no support, and that's part of the draw of it. You can feel different types of ground underneath your feet. So I've got a dressy sort of nice work pair of boots. They're both from the company Vivo Barefoot. It's a smaller company out of the UK. And so this one is sort of, it's acceptable in office environment, and it's very basic, and I love it. And you can wear it basically anywhere, except it's like natural leather, so I don't try to walk through puddles in it. And then I just recently got these trail running shoes. I love trail running shoes because those are like the minivan of shoes. They're like the do-it-all shoes. Anything active, you can get them wet. You don't have to baby them at all, and they look kind of cool too. So these are Vivo Barefoot Primus Trail 2 FG or something. So yeah, I'm loving them. So check out barefoot shoes. It's a whole world.
You learn something new every day.
Tell you what,
I've never heard of that whole movement.
I used to have basically flat feet. And since I learned how to walk properly when I was 30, and I started being barefoot as much as possible, or just having socks or just wearing barefoot shoes, I now have real arches. Like it has, and that's had a positive effect on my legs and my hips and my back. So check it out.
That is so interesting. Wow. I did not know that was a thing.
Yeah. Or we're just getting started. We haven't even talked about mental health yet.
No. Maybe I'm trying to delay that a little bit, asking more questions. So I think like a huge goal of this episode for me is to not turn this into Kevin's therapy session. That's like, like we need to not go like that has happened on this podcast before. So we're going to try to veer clear of that. But tell us a little bit about Embrace. How did the name come about? How did you get started doing that?
So it's my project. Wesley is just like one of the best finds of all time to have helped me with this project. But mental health is something that I have personally struggled with, and especially anxiety. And to kind of cut a long story short, if you want to hear the full story, I have an episode of my full story. But I struggled with anxiety, and it really came to a head in 2020. And at that point, I feel like for up until that point, my approach to my mental health had been a little bit more avoidant or trying to, pieces of denial or even a fear of my mental health problems.
Mm.
And somewhere in that, I made a switch and decided to embrace the challenge. I grew up as an athlete, and so the thought of embracing a challenge within sports was something that I was familiar with and was a familiar mindset for me. But I hadn't really applied it to mental health and specifically my mental health challenges, and kind of decided, okay, I can embrace any challenge. And that was one of the things that was a paradigm shift for me, especially in terms of how I thought of my mental health. And so when I've heard since then, I've been wanting to start some sort of mental health project. People had told me a lot that I should start a book or should write a book, and I just don't have time for that. Writing takes a lot of time, although, as I've learned, podcasting takes a lot of time too. But
Add up the hours, yeah.
yeah, but I think talking with your friends is a little bit more fun and easier to do than sitting down and writing. At least for me, I'm pretty sure I have undiagnosed ADHD. but but anyway, so right around last spring, I was like, well, one thing I could do is I could do a podcast. And then as I was thinking about what should I name it, and then I said, embrace. I think one of the interesting pieces of embrace too is that embrace sometimes can look like a hug, and embrace sometimes can look like wrestling. And so,
Mm.
as you're working through your mental health, embracing a challenge sometimes might mean coming to terms and making friends with some of the things that you've considered enemies before. But sometimes embracing your mental health can also look a lot like wrestling. And so I guess that's just some of the concepts behind that name, and kind of the rest was history.
Yeah. That's so powerful to think about embracing it. And you're saying, what used to be an enemy. And I think one of the most powerful things that I've heard in dealing with depression is that having depression is not a sin.
Yeah.
Because I just thought of myself as sinful for dealing with it because I was dealing with it. Like I thought that was a sin. And hearing someone tell me at my kitchen table, like, just because you're depressed doesn't mean you're in sin. Like, that was a paradigm shift for me.
Mm-hmm.
Of being able to say, like, okay, no, like acknowledging like this is a part of me. And I don't know that I had the embrace mindset, but like I embraced the fact that, like, okay, this is a part of me, so how do we live life with this and thrive in spite of it?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really powerful. In your first episode that you guys released, you talked about trying to narrow down your niche, because if anyone started a podcast, they know, like, one of the first things they tell you is, like, the more specific you can get with your niche, the better off you are, right? So it's like our target audience for this is the millennial dad, right? Like most of our listeners are 25 to 40-year-old guys. Like we have some outside of that, but that's our primary audience. You're like, anyone that has mental health, like, which I feel like is just everyone either deals with it or someone that they love deals with it. Like, I don't think you're like more than one person removed from it.
Yeah.
Pretty much anywhere.
Yeah.
It's like either you or someone significant to you deals with it. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but that's just...
Well, another way to actually, I would broaden it even further, because mental health, you can think of it like a spectrum. And so even if you are very mentally healthy, mental health is still a part of your life. Even people who are, they're really functioning in their lives really well, and they're coping with their challenges very effectively. And anybody on the outside would not say this person has a mental health problem. Well, they're really mentally healthy, and they may still be thinking a lot about mental health concepts as they go about their day. So even if it's not even if you don't have a mental health struggle or a challenge, mental health it's just part of being human.
Yeah. And this is why Wesley was the greatest find for Kelsey. Right
Yes.
there. Is that, I mean, that's great insight though, is that, as I've shared, like, I feel like this will always be something I have to be conscious of. Even when I'm in a very mentally healthy state, it's something that I will just always be thinking of. But why is it, like you talk about, like, some people are very mentally healthy, but they're thinking about it all the time. But clearly the statistics bear out that the overall mental health of at least Americans is not well.
Yeah.
Compared to what it's been. Like, why is that? Has it always been that way and we just notice it more now? Or is this kind of a new phenomenon of mental health being this issue?
That's a big question. I don't know if I'm quite qualified to answer that, because that gets into, sociology and politics. But I guess if I had to give my personal view on it, it would be that I would say it's primarily that we're noticing it more, that it's less stigmatized, and it's that we have new words for it, right? We have a new concept of what it is. Things that now are called mental health challenges before would be called, um, you know, somebody is crazy, somebody is loony, somebody is hysterical. That's kind of a classic word that was used about women who might have like a panic attack or something like that. They would say, "Oh, she's hysterical," right? So over the decades and the centuries, we've had different words and different ideas of what mental health is. And so now, really, I would say the language is changing, and overall in a way that is more effective, a way that can help us see it like, okay, this is a part of who we are, or this is a part of us that we can change, or a part of us that we can learn from. We have a whole mental health field to address this. So I think that's probably the biggest piece. But also, I would say that probably in the US, we have different expectations for productivity. Um, I would say that obviously we have a lot more divisiveness in our society than most other cultures have, and we have a lot more diversity as well. And those two things, I think, go hand in hand as well. Not that diversity is a bad thing, but you can't get people from all different cultures and backgrounds, and of course, even within the U.S., you look at the Yankees and the South, and the West Coasters and the East Coasters, and I mean, the saying that the US is this way is just really impossible. So you get that many people together trying to steer this huge ship, and that's going to cause some neurosis. That's going to cause some distress.
I think too, another piece, I looked up a statistic, and over 70% of people, of adults, have experienced trauma in their life. And I mean, that's just the reality. It doesn't really matter who you are. You can be well off financially. You can be in a safe neighborhood. You can have all these things in place, have access to all the right resources, and life can still be hard. There are changes that are unexpected. There's health problems. There's car accidents. There's, loss and change. And I think for a long time, trauma was just assumed to be, oh, if you were abused as a kid or if you went to war, that was people who had experienced trauma in their life. The reality is life is hard. And so I don't think life being hard is a new phenomenon. Like I said, I think some of the language we have around it and some of our recognition of what mental health struggles can look like has changed. But I don't think mental health is a new phenomenon, nor do I think mental health problems are a new phenomenon. They're just actually, like he said, there's a mental health field now to better kind of help understand. I mean, you can look through his history textbooks and say, yeah, there was probably some mental illness there. They may not have had that language for it, but I don't think everyone was super mentally healthy. And then all of a sudden in the 2000s and the 21st century, we just all like collectively lost our minds. I think we're just, like Wesley said, the stigma is starting to come away from it somewhat. There's still way too much around it, but life is hard, and it's always been hard, and it's probably always will continue to be hard in just different ways. And so, if you think about it, if you look at football players, for instance, if you follow a guy who is in the NFL and you follow, if you take all NFL players, how many of them have experienced injuries at some point in their career? Probably all of them. And so that, is a little bit more, okay, yep, somebody played football, they have injuries, they might limp a little bit now, or they might have some residual effects from that. Really, in some ways, life is like a football career. Like, you're probably going to come across an injury at some point or another. And so that's just a different way of thinking about it, that life injures us sometimes. And so you have reactions to that.
Yeah, tying that into the family piece, Kevin, I was just talking to my wife like 1 or 2 nights ago about, I'm starting this business and we're having a third kid pretty soon. And so I think anybody could look at just those two facts right there and say, okay, you guys are in a stressful period of life. But I was just
Yeah.
saying to her that, our kids, they don't know, they're so ignorant to the horrors of the world. And that's a wonderful thing, of course. That wasn't like, so we need to expose them. No, that was like, I am so thankful that they don't know real fear. They have not been through any kind of serious trauma. They um, they just have no awareness of, the world can be a horrible place, certainly in the United States, and even more so all around the world. They don't know poverty, they don't know hunger, a lot of challenges that are actually really common even today. And especially if you look back through human history, I mean, we're easily in the top 1% of the luckiest, most blessed, most privileged families that has ever existed. And so anyway, that just kind of gave me some perspective that even though we're in a sort of stressful period of life, uh, we have it really good. We have so much to be thankful for.
Yeah. And, what Kelsey said, like, life being hard is not a new phenomenon. And Wesley, you said, like, we're in the top 1% in the history of the world.
Mhm.
But I think a part of it is probably the fact that we compare ourselves to the 0.0001%
Yeah.
of the top of the world, right? And so how much do you think that, the internet, specifically social media, impacts one's mental health? Because, I mean, it's like you're looking at other people's highlight reels, right?
Mhm.
And you're looking at like the best of the best of them, and not you see some of these videos of like, hey, run these errands with me, and it's like, I don't understand why some of these videos exist, right? But they're like,
Yeah.
run to Target with, and it's like you look at it and you're like, all right, they like set up the tripod in the parking lot to record themselves getting out of the car, and then park the car, and then like got the tripod and set it up before they walk in the store. It's like you're looking at like the highlight reels and not all the weird behind the scenes stuff that's happening. Whereas
Yeah.
we experience all of our day-to-day behind the scenes stuff, right? Like
Right.
we know, hey, I lost my temper today. My kid did this today. I had this fight with my spouse today. But look at this influencer, or look at this celebrity, or look at my best friend even that, is on her trip in Jamaica right now, like whatever it
Mhm.
is. How much does that impact our mental health on the day-to-day, do you see?
The research is clear. It's bad for our mental health. Basically, all of the research that has been done on social media and mental health shows that it's a negative. And so, if you want to be mentally healthy, cutting social media out of your life would not be a bad idea. Now, of course, there are lots of
Mm,
benefits to social media as well, and there are some ways of approaching it that are healthier than others. And so, I'm not saying that everyone should go out and do that, but I would say that if we all went out and did that, we would be a healthier society. And Kevin, your point about comparison is huge. Comparison, again, that's a part of being human. That's the way we're designed. It's a survival mechanism. It's a good thing that we compare ourselves to one another as far as survival goes. Just
mm,
our ancestors. It's what got us to where we are today. But in our modern world, where a lot of us at least have the basics of what we need, then that comparison is more of a detriment, and our brains are not equipped to handle the internet. uh,
wow.
I sometimes lament like how many people give up playing the guitar because they are no longer comparing themselves to everyone they know. They're comparing themselves to the best guitar players in the history of the world because that's what's at their fingertips. How many people give up on public speaking because they watch TED Talks and they think that is just light years ahead of where I could be,
Yeah.
and but
Goodness.
then the other side of it is that we have the news bombarding us with the headlines of the worst things happening around the world. And you think back a couple hundred years, you know, uh, most of us would probably be unaware of the war going on in Israel right now, or in between the Israeli government and Hamas. We would have no idea. And
Yeah.
so, does that make what does that mean for our mental health? And somebody who I really admire posted on Facebook a while back. There's a lot going on in the world. I think it was around an election season or something, and other kinds of problems in our country and around the world. And he was saying that um, think about your life and the things that actually make a difference in your day to day life, and let those be your headlines as well. So it's like, man loves and respects his wife today. That's a headline, or kid says I'm sorry to his friend who he knocked down, and I mean, so that's the other side of it, is that even though we can look at sort of the best of the best and the cream of the crop examples out there, and we unfairly compare our lives to it, we also absorb the worst of the worst, and we think that the world is this horrible, dangerous place. And from some perspectives it is, but it's like, how much of all those headlines is actually going to affect my life? And how much is it affecting my mental health, thinking that it's going to affect my life? So long answer, but just some thoughts on that. Yeah.
No, I think that's really powerful. Change it, and I think a lot like, okay, I can't directly impact like what's happening in the White House, but I can directly impact what's happening in my house.
Exactly.
And I have way more influence here than I will ever have there, right? And sometimes it's like, hey, I need to, whatever's going to happen there is going to happen, whether I'm worrying about it or not. But there's things that I have to take care of here at home and focus my efforts there. But it takes a lot of mental work to get to that point.
That's not natural to do. Yeah.
To focus your energy in the right spot and focus on what you can control. And it was something I think Wes had said in one of your episodes, or I think it was the stress episode, which I think you titled "Too Stressed to Be Blessed," if I remember correctly. But you said something about like, if there's a threat and we feel powerless to respond to that threat. You said something about, and that just clicked and it resonated so deeply with me. Because I don't know if you guys are into Enneagram. I'm an Enneagram 8. And so as a challenger, like my greatest fear is not having control of a situation. Like that is like a driving motivator for me, is having control. And it's like, if a threat happens and I feel powerless, like that will send my mental health all out the window, because like I need to be able to control a situation or respond to something, and knowing what triggers you, I think, is a huge part of that. Now you guys said, you had a hard time narrowing down your niche because it's pretty much everybody, right? Which it's like, you're one of the few podcasts out there that like I would agree with that statement, right? But we already kind of laid out who our niche is, and anyone listening to this knows. But I wanted to lay out specifically a couple of interesting points relating to men and their mental health, and you guys can chime in as you want. But it's found from the ADAA, which Anxiety and Depression Association of America. It says 1 in 10 men experience depression or anxiety, but less than half will receive treatment. And 4 times as many men as women die by suicide every year. And men are more likely to report fatigue, irritability, loss of interest in work or hobbies, rather than feelings of sadness or worthlessness, which that one struck home for me a lot, because that was something that for years was me, because I didn't want to report that I was just sad. And then another one is that men are less likely than women to seek help for depression, substance abuse, and stressful life events due to social norms, reluctance to talk, and downplaying symptoms. How have you guys, in the work that you're doing, whether through the podcast or just through your careers and personal lives, how have you seen mental health impacting men and women differently?
Kelsey?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I looked up the analytics of our podcast for last night just to kind of see, where our audience is at this point. And as of last night, of our whole audience, only 3.7% are men. And
I am in that. I'm
yeah,
in the 3%.
I'm part of the 3%. Yeah, it might be you and Wes. I'm not sure, but and that's
that's very interesting though.
Yeah,
I figured it'd be lopsided, but that's a lot more lopsided than I would have thought.
We have just as many people listening in Puerto Rico as we do men listening to this podcast, which is crazy.
There you go.
But and we've tried to, I've tried to design my logo in a way that wasn't overly feminine. We've tried to make our social media at least gender neutral, and then obviously one of our co-hosts is a man, so I was hoping to make it accessible for men, but there is just something about mental health that I don't even think it's a lack of interest. I don't think people are just like, I don't think men are like, oh, that just sounds boring. I think there's just a little bit of a different block there for men than there is for women. And I have some theories on where that might be, but I'm going to let Wes talk first.
Yeah, sure. Well, serving men, being a man in the mental health field, it's kind of a de facto that I'm going to be working with men because a lot of guys are most comfortable talking about these issues to another guy. When I was with Hospice of Michigan, I was a big part of a men's loss group, and it ended up being really a men's loss of spouse group, the loss of a spouse or a partner. And we found that when we were offering just co-ed groups, groups for anybody to come to, it was very, very rare that a man would show up, and basically never happened that a man would stick with the group, because he would come, he would see it's like, me and 4 or 5 women, and I'm not going to stick around for that. But when we made something just for men, it actually became one of the bigger groups in the organization out of the, a couple dozen groups that we were putting on. And so I think that there is a need there. There's a yearning there. And it was guys from all different generations. I would say mostly middle age and older. Of course, you think about loss of a spouse or partner and the kinds of guys who are going through that. But we also did a young adults group. And that was for adults in their 20s and 30s. And that one, I would say maybe 30 or 40% of the people in there were men. And so I do think that younger men are more receptive than older men to concepts about mental health, a little bit less stigmatized. But yeah, I think that if I could speak from my personal experience as well as my observations, it would be that just in general, guys, we feel like we need to, that idea that we need to sort of man up is still there. And what that implies is we need to basically shut up, carry the burden, don't complain, right? This is what it means to be a man for a lot of us. And so if I am talking about my challenges, my struggles, if I am expressing my feelings, if I'm crying in front of other people, that makes me less of a man and therefore a less valuable human being, and I think that women don't necessarily feel that. And a lot of it has to do with social conditioning. I think, maybe part of it is just kind of the way that we're designed, but I would say that most of it is social conditioning. It's the way that we're raised from young boys and the messages that we get, whether somebody told it to us directly or just the stuff that we see in the media. But those kinds of stigmas are there. But yeah, I get to work with guys. I think that about half of my clients are men. And again, I think it comes back to that okay, if I'm gonna talk about mental health, I'm gonna talk to another guy because he'll at least understand, what my struggles are or how hard it is for me to talk about my struggles.
I think part of it too, I think, for especially probably all the way from the Stone Age, all the way even until probably the Industrial Revolution, men were seen, and not only seen, but they were the protectors of their family. And
Good
so
point.
not only was vulnerability actually life-threatening, even the perception of vulnerability could be life-threatening. Now, as
Very well
some
said.
of that has changed, and you don't have to physically protect your family as much as you used to, some of those perceptions are still out there that vulnerability is life-threatening and emotion is vulnerability, especially when you think about like sadness and some of those types of emotions. A lot of men, I think, are much more comfortable with their anger than they are with their sadness, or than they are with their fear.
Yeah.
Because anger gives you this false sense of control. A lot of times it's not actual control, it just makes you feel in control. And sadness doesn't give you that same feeling of control. It gives you an opposite feeling in a lot of ways.
Vulnerability.
Yes. And so for a long time, vulnerability in men could be life-threatening for you, and it could be life-threatening for your family. And now it's gotten to a point where not being able to work through your sadness and some of that vulnerability is actually what's becoming life-threatening, where that's leading to suicide and
Changing world. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's a great point, Kelsey. I just want to kind of go with that because anger, I think, is an issue that affects probably more men than women proportionally. And I would say that I do often share with clients and with my grief groups that I've done that anger is often a masking emotion. And so sometimes anger is just anger, but a lot of times it's just the first one that we reach for on the shelf because it's what's most comfortable for us. For a lot of guys, it's the only one that we were told was acceptable for
Mm-hmm.
a boy or a man to have. And that it totally has to do with that it's not as vulnerable. But I always encourage people to ask, okay, what else might be there behind the anger? Might there be pain or sadness or fear or some of these kinds of feelings that are just part of being human, but we're more vulnerable to admit that. And I love what you said too, Kelsey, about our roles in society. And absolutely, I mean, again, a couple hundred years ago, if you were a vulnerable man who was crying a lot, you actually were less valuable to your family and to society. Like that was the reality. And right or wrong, it was what it was. And so 2 or 3 generations is not a very long time to have to sort of adjust to the demands and expectations of the ways the world's changed.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a whole episode on vulnerability here this season. And so if you haven't listened to that episode with Coach Red Wallace, go jump on and listen to that. I think it was episode 23. But one of the things we also talked about was, as adults, it can be so hard for us as adult men to be vulnerable because we've been vulnerable in the past and it's been weaponized against us. And I know I've experienced that, both like as a kid, as a teenager growing up, and as an adult, in relationships and friendships, and even within the church, I've had that weaponized against me. And so I think that creates yet another barrier for men to overcome. And I think, like in hearing what you're saying, talking about anger gives us that sense of control where it's like, hey, if I get angry in my house, everyone in my house might listen to me and do what I say. If I have this anger come out. And so that's a very insightful perspective to take in thinking like, okay, why am I reaching for anger before I'm reaching for these other emotions? Because it is just an emotion like all the others. So Wes, maybe you can't talk about this. I want to respect the work that you do, but I'm just curious to know, like when men come into your office and sit down with you, do you generally find them willing to open up, or is it a lot of deep work? Like once they sit down with the counselor, is it a lot of work to get them to open up? Because for me, it took me years to be willing to go and see a counselor. But I'm also the type of person that like once I'm in, I'm in. And so it's like I jumped right on the couch and I just started spewing, right? Because I was like, I'm here, I'm gonna make the most of my time and my money, and I'm gonna get the most out of it.
Right.
Like what's your experience usually with guys coming in? Like I'm curious to know. And if you can't talk about that, I respect that.
No, I can just talk in general terms, and I would say it is a wide variety. There are some guys who come in, and I would say the trend that I have seen is that it's often younger guys who are more willing to open up right away, and they're like, yeah, let's kind of cut the crap and let's talk about what's really going on. And then there are other guys who are, I guess, maybe more on the other end of the spectrum where they are just, I can feel their discomfort as soon as they walk in the room, just with being here and sitting on my leather couch and having me use the kinds of words that I'm using. And I don't like to mess around either. I mean, I try to be sensitive to where people are at and um, to what their needs are. And so I don't intentionally hurt or offend anyone. But at the same time, for instance, if I'm talking to somebody about death, I'm going to use the word death. I'm not going to say passed away to somebody who's here to talk about their grief. We're going to talk about how the person died. And so with guys, talking about feelings, talking about trauma, talking about abuse, talking about addiction, whatever it is, we're going to call it what it is. But yeah, a lot of times it is uncomfortable. And I know that it's going to have to involve some exposure and just kind of me laying the groundwork for, we're going to get this out in the open and talk about this here. I mean, what are you here for? Right. And to kind of talk as guys talk to one another, I would say, um, and understand it, to show them that I understand where they're coming from and what the kinds of expectations they might have on them. But yeah, so for some guys, the discomfort is palpable, and it does take some kind of, finding that fine line of being direct with them and not beating around the bush too much, but also kind of easing into the water and saying, okay, I can tell that even though for you it's an illusion of strength, you're actually pretty scared to go there. And so let's go to this place that's a little bit more within reach. It feels a little bit, and you can get that feeling of accomplishment. And then as we do that, you'll kind of get used to the temperature of the water, and we'll be able to get in a little bit deeper. And I would say that most guys are somewhere in between.
So really, really a spectrum of responses coming into that.
Yeah, but I would say I definitely have more men who are uncomfortable in the beginning than women. I would say that most women who are seeking mental health help from a therapist, they're definitely the majority are ready to kind of get right in. But there are certainly some women who are also very uncomfortable crying and talking about vulnerability too. So definitely not a one size fits all either way.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, it's over 6 million men have been reported to suffer from some sort of mental illness, but generally accepted that there's a lot more that just undiagnosed, unwilling to seek help. And I think, we've talked about a lot of the reasons why it's hard for men to kind of go there. But how do we as individuals and as a society at large kind of turn that tide? Because I think it's something like you have to be talking about it. The longer and longer that you bottle these things up and don't deal with it, just the worse it gets. And I started finding freedom and help and relief from it when I started opening up and being vulnerable with my spouse and with friends. So how do we as a society and as individuals kind of turn that tide to make it, I guess, more acceptable and more encouraging for men to seek help when they need it?
It's a big question. I don't think that there's an easy answer to that. I think we need to look at what are the problems? What are the things getting in the way of that right now? And how can we combat those? And so, Kevin, you were talking about how vulnerability has been weaponized against men sometimes, or I would say more often against boys or teenage boys. And so I think that really we need to be the change that we want to see. It has to start with us, and I have control over what I'm doing, you have control over what you're doing. And so it's going to take um, setting a good example for other men, whether they're our peers, whether they're our sons, or the kids who are in our lives. And of course for women and girls too. I mean, I think that probably women and girls do also hold up this stigma and may criticize men in their lives when they're vulnerable. So we can't just say that it's an isolated problem with men. And so I assume that there are some women out there who listen to this, or who might overhear it on a speaker. And so, I encourage you to take a look at your own self in life as well and think about how you can make a change. But yeah, I would say that's probably the most powerful thing that your listeners can do is, where in my own life might I be um, afraid of talking about my own mental health? How can I model that for the other guys in my life? How can I really be, and again, it's this kind of counterintuitive thing, because the whole thing is that we want to feel strong and in control and brave, but really by avoiding the thing that makes us uncomfortable, that is actually, I would say, being weak in a way. And it's understandable. I don't say that in a way of criticizing, but really the strong thing is to admit that you're vulnerable. In this case, the strong thing is to say, I'm not going to hide or avoid this problem. I'm going to bring it out into the light and address it like a man, you might say. So I think a lot of it has to do with, changing this whole perspective, changing this dialogue. And sometimes it is going to take some courage, because you might be in an environment where you're maybe with guys who are uncomfortable or something. And so it might just be a little, I kind of see it differently, and explaining the way that you see it. I think that a lot of those little changes building up over time is what's really going to change it. So I don't know that there's anything that we can do to make it easier for guys to address their own mental health within the next 5 years, but hopefully within the next 50 years, we'll be in a very different place, and then it's going to be the small things.
I think a couple of things that come to my mind with this question. The first to me is that sharing is powerful, and, exposure is powerful.
Mhm.
And so, for men who have mental health struggles, being willing to talk about it and be that example for other people of, well, I know KG, he's a dude, like he's a man's man, or he's not a girly guy, or I don't know, whatever the perceptions would be, but like, think they see you as a strong person. And then if you're willing to say like, oh yeah, this is something I struggle with, just the more people that can be open and honest with it, that's one thing. And obviously part of this comes from the fact that I'm a female, but that's one thing. I've never been shy about sharing my struggles with mental health. And predominantly the response that I get from people is not like, oh my gosh, why are you oversharing? Or why are you like putting all your ish out there? But a lot of it is, that was so powerful. I needed somebody else who I could relate to, me too. And just, maybe they're not then prepared to tell everybody in their whole life about it. But that's why I've almost felt more empowered to keep sharing my journey through it, is because I've found that sharing has been powerful for other people, because then they know they're not alone, and then they know there are people that I respect who have this struggle, so I don't need to beat myself up for that. Another thing I think, sorry,
I want
go
to
ahead.
pause right there, because I want to, that brings up a very interesting point, because I've definitely gotten that response when I've shared stuff, but I've also, as a guy, when I've shared something like in a men's group, it turns into a let's fix Kevin session. And it's a very guy thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think like hearing you say that kind of sparks that thought of like, that might be part of the problem too, is sometimes when someone shares, like they're not looking for an answer. Like our response as guys, when my wife, I have to ask my wife sometimes if she's venting, like, do you want me to listen or do you want me to fix it? Like, and that question has become so powerful in our marriage, because like,
yeah, that's awesome.
it lets me off the hook, right? But I think like that is not always been the response I receive when I share is like, oh, thank you so much. I needed someone to share that too. I've gotten that, but more often with guys, it's a let's fix Kevin session. Then I think just changing that response when someone does share with us and is vulnerable with us, changing that I think can be a very powerful starting point for us too.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that on. I want
That's
to
a
hear
really
the
good
rest
point.
of your thoughts on that. But
yeah, I think that kind of ties into my second point a little bit. The mental health field has been predominantly a woman-led field, just because, I mean, that's just been the nature of it. And so I do think there is a certain level of which some of the language around mental health can be a little bit more feminine. Even the context of getting help. For women, like, okay, that's just another, I get help. For men, that's like immediately like, no, but I'm self-sufficient. I could do this on my own.
yeah.
And honestly,
Yeah.
you don't even have to view going to therapy as getting help. It can be seen as like, okay, it's a consultation. I'm working with somebody to help me optimize my productivity, or even something as building up resilience or increasing my mental strength. Finding some of those ways that connect a little bit better with how men might think about some of their mental health struggles, and not putting it in such feminine language or in such a way of how women tend to experience their mental health struggles.
I'm just picturing every guy now, instead of saying I'm going to see my therapist, saying I'm going to see a consultant.
Consultant, yeah.
I'm just like no guy would shy away from that. Like,
right.
It's like, oh, like he's seeing a consultant. Like he's got his ish together. Like,
right.
That's such a different viewpoint, but it is kind of that.
And I think it has a little bit to do with power dynamics too, of even a man thinking like, oh, if I have to go talk to a therapist and I'm going to have to be kind of this person, I'm going to have to admit that this person knows better than me, knows more than me, or whatever, and I'm going to be in a less powerful position.
Yeah, a submissive position.
A submissive position.
There's a tongue twister.
Yes. But that's not, I mean, I'm sure there are probably some therapists who operate that way, but there's so many good therapists out there. And I think the best types of therapists are the ones who are going to walk alongside you, not be, not have this so much, but bring it down to here, so that, where there's a little bit more of a consultation, or, whatever a different word for that, but make it just a little bit more accessible for how you think about it
Yeah.
for men.
And I think too, like feeling the freedom to like fire your therapist and find a new one. Like
Yeah.
I had a couple that I did not connect with. Like they I didn't feel like I was connecting with them, like it was helpful at all. Maybe that was on me. But I finally found one that is like, hey, from day one, I was like, okay, like he understands me. And like I felt like he was on my team,
Yeah.
and he wasn't
Yeah.
just trying to fix me. Even though like that's
Mhm.
kind of what I'm paying him for, right? That's what I'm there for. In a way. But yeah, it took me a couple tries with a couple different ones, honestly. And the first one or two kind of turned me off from the idea because I was thinking like, oh, all counseling's like this. Um, and maybe it's just, the years in between, just I kind of grew as a person. But yeah, I think like, hey, feeling the ability to say like, okay, like, if you're investing your money and you're hiring a financial advisor to handle your investments and he's losing money, you're going to fire the dude,
Mhm.
right? Like, and get a new guy. I think, hey, if we could feel the freedom to say like, okay, I might need to try somebody else here. Like, I think that's okay. Um, and
Yeah.
if you're hiring Wes, don't fire Wes. If you're seeing
Well,
Wes, like,
actually, I do use that language sometimes. Like I will tell my clients if I am getting to a place in therapy where I'm being kind of directive and saying, hey, here are the next steps, here's where we're headed. I'll sometimes back off a little bit and say, does that sound good to you? I work for you. Let's let this be a time that
mm,
that you are going to find helpful. And so, if I want to do this like EMDR thing to sort of like engage both sides of your brain, and it's this whole process, but you just want to like talk and vent to me, I may not believe that that's going to be the most helpful, but you're the expert of your own life and you're paying me to help you. And so if you think this is going to be helpful, that's great. There's nothing wrong with respecting experts in their field. Like your example, Kevin, of the financial advising. It's like, is it, uh, is it not manly to let somebody do your taxes? Is it not manly to let somebody make you food? Is it not manly? Like whatever it is, there are people who it's like, this is what they do. This is their role in society. And so we have to be realistic about that because otherwise, are you really going to be 100% self-sufficient in your life? I mean, that is such a myth. It's one thing to
yeah,
try to strive to implement that as much as you can, sure, as a process, that's one thing. But to say I'm not going to get help from somebody who knows what they're talking about better than I do, that's foolishness. But at the same time, that
yeah,
is the dominant kind of mythos for men in our society. uh, and Kevin, I think also I just want to go back to what you said earlier about the man's tendency to want to fix. And we know in the mental health field that oftentimes structured problem solving of saying, okay, here's my problem, I'm going to give you the fix and the solution, it's simply not what is most effective. And that is really counterintuitive for a lot of
mm,
people, and certainly for a lot of men. Problem, solution, done. I've got a hammer and a nail, and that's all that I need. But what actually helps people a lot of times is just sitting with it and letting it be what it is, and letting people
mm,
find their own way, and going to the feeling, and these kinds of things. So I think embracing the fact that it is counterintuitive, it might be uncomfortable, and that's okay. And to actually love the part of myself that can sit with something that's uncomfortable, that's a cool skill to be able to do. That is a huge life skill, to be able to face something that I'm not comfortable with, but to do it anyway and see what I can learn.
mm. Yeah, that's really powerful. Um, and I love you gave the analogy of like, would you not pay someone to do your taxes? Like the invoice that I pay to my tax person every year is the best invoice I pay all
Yeah.
year long.
I'm
Like
happy to give you this. Yeah.
I
$300-$400, whatever.
despise doing taxes, and they get me more money back than if I did them myself, right? So
That's
it's like
right.
they more than pay for themselves. But it's like, to me, it's this idea of like, I have this team in my life of professionals that like I pay, to help
Mhm.
me and my family be the best that we can be, And
Yeah.
so it's like, hey, if this is necessary for you, add this in. Seek that professional help. I think that's great. I don't want to keep you guys too much longer, but I do want to ask this link, because at the end of season 1 of this, we kind of pulled our audience and said like, hey, what are the topics you guys want to hear us talk about on here? And the 2 runaway answers were mental health and porn addiction. I was like, cool, like 2 easy ones, right?
Nice light,
And
fluffy topics. Yeah.
Smooth sailing.
yeah, we'll throw out we can do a whole season about these. But like for me, it really hit home for me because they're 2 things that are a part of my story. And 2 things that no matter how much freedom I feel like I have in those areas, I always feel like I'm gonna have to guard against it. Like, I'm never putting the sword away. Like, the sword and shield are always at the ready in these
Yeah.
2 areas of my life. Like, I feel like that's kind of how it is. What do you see as the link, if any, between those 2? Both for men and for women, because, every year it seems like the statistics of the amount of women caught in porn addiction also goes up. And so just as a general thing across the genders, like, what do you see as the link between those 2 things?
Well, I can go here. And Kelsey, if you want to chime in, of course, that's great too. To me, porn addiction. Well, okay, there's my and I don't necessarily implement this in my work with most clients, but there is the spiritual aspect of it, looking at it from that perspective, and I think that there's a whole battle and a whole thing that I could talk about there. But also, I think from another perspective, it is totally a mental health issue. Porn addiction, my understanding of it anyway, having helped guys successfully with it in therapy, is that any kind of sexual addiction, and porn addiction is very similar in the brain to any other kind of sex addiction, even though it's less punished in our society. But any kind of sex addiction has to do with really the way that you see yourself, often because of some trauma that you've been through. But I would say that well over 90% of the time, it has to do with this idea that I am not good enough or lovable as I am. I am not acceptable as I am. And the love and the loyalty of other people in my life is not predictable. But you know what's predictable? That feeling that I
Wow.
get when I watch pornography, that feeling that I get when I masturbate, and even the shame that often comes after that initial euphoric high. Even the fact that that is there and that is predictable reinforces the whole cycle. So,
Wow.
yeah. So if anybody is interested in, if you feel like you're addicted to pornography or any other kind of sexual addiction, therapy can definitely be helpful. There are whole schools of thought that have been around for decades on this exact topic. So yeah, that's the battlefield, is mental health.
I don't feel like I have a whole lot to input into this. There's a reality in which men are almost a little bit more comfortable talking about porn than women are. And so it's really not something that I've heard a whole lot on. So I think, any sort of addiction has it's filling some sort of a need, right? And some sort of unmet need. And so and that easily falls into the mental health field of unmet needs generally lead to trying to fill it in some way. And whether that comes through porn or whether that comes through excessive worry or whether that comes through
Gambling.
gambling.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of different ways that we try to, to talk about something before, to feel a better sense of control over those unmet needs. And so I think there's definitely a tie there with any kind of addiction. And, there are certain addictions that are more socially acceptable than others, but, it can be addicting to look up your health problems on WebMD. That's can
Mm,
be, like I've fallen into that trap sometimes where I had to shut Google off of my phone after a certain point because I would just diagnose myself to death, and that was probably a way that I was feeling an unmet need. But other addictions
mm.
are seen as less acceptable. And so then you, like Wes said, you add in that guilt piece to it too, that just really cements that cycle. So,
Right. It's like, see, you are unlovable, right?
mhm.
That's the message. So,
Mm.
yeah, I think that if I could put a challenge out to your listeners to kind of start thinking along this track, if this is an issue that you're dealing with, it would be to ask yourself, um, what need is this fulfilling in my life? Like Kelsey was talking about, what is this doing for me? And not in a self-critical, I'm a piece of crap kind of way, like, oh, it's because I'm a loser or an animal or something like that. No, don't go there. What is an understandable need that this is fulfilling for you? What is how is this helping you feel better? Because whenever there's something that we are doing that we want to stop doing but can't stop, we have to ask ourselves the question, what part of me wants to keep doing this? Right? There might be the part of me that I like more that wants to stop doing this. But
Mm.
if that was all there was, I'd be done right now. So there's a part of me that wants to keep doing this. And what can I learn from that part? I don't have to hate that part. I don't have to shut it down. What is it trying to tell me? So it's kind of an interesting question and thought experiment and challenge for people to start thinking about.
Yeah, and I love the way that you guys both frame that, because it's not just the porn, right? It's not
Right.
just the sexual addiction. It's the unmet need. And, for me, it took me years to realize it, but it's like, hey, once I kind of conquered the porn addiction part, it took me a while after that to realize that I substituted that with binge eating.
Mhm.
That it's like when I felt and someone had laid it out for me before, halts, the acronym halts. I don't know if either of you guys had ever, HALTS. Anytime, guys will often turn to porn when they're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, or stressed out.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Right? Like those are like 5 of the biggest triggers for guys. And I often did that. And so, when I finally kicked that, it was like, all right, when I'm hungry, angry, lonely, tired, or stressed out, like I went to the pantry, I went to the fridge, and it's like, it took me years to realize, like, because I wasn't actually dealing with the core issue. The core issue wasn't just
Yeah.
a porn addiction, it was this unmet need. And I don't know that I ever necessarily even understood it until you guys framed it that way. But that's a very good way to kind of sit with yourself and think, like, hey, what is the unmet need that I'm looking to fill by getting the phone out and going to that site, or whatever the case might be.
Yeah. Another way to phrase what you just said, Kevin, is that pornography addiction is basically never the problem. It's the symptom.
Yeah.
Mm,
Right.
Yeah.
So, and
yep.
when I've shared that with clients before, it's like, you thought you were coming here to work on your porn addiction. And sure, I mean, we can talk about some simple practical things that we can do to make it harder for you to look at porn that'll make your battle easier. But until you address this thing that is the problem of which porn is a symptom, then yeah, exactly. You're either not going to be able to beat this addiction, or it's just going to manifest in some other way.
Kind of
Mm,
reminds me, we just did an episode called Weeds and Seeds, and it was a way that a framework that I use to kind of understand my mental health struggles. And, a lot of times you have these weeds, and the weeds on top, they can be your symptoms. And a lot of times we try to go for symptom management or coping with, negative thought patterns or all kinds of different ways that weeds can manifest, so to speak. And just like a regular garden, if you just cut it off at the surface, it's either going to grow back stronger or, another weed is going to grow up in its place. But to grow, to get rid of a weed, you've got to dig it down to your roots. So that's, what is the unmet need? That's
Mhm.
what's at the root of this. And
mm,
then after you find that root, not only do you take it out, I mean, there's been a number of times when I've been gardening and I do all the weeding and then I just stop. And then a week later, I've just got a whole new bed of weeds. You have to plant something in its place too. You have to plant something healthy or a different
awesome.
framework, or, meeting that need in its place. And that's what truly leads to healing and growing what you want in your life. It's not just, I'm going to stop watching porn and everything will be fine. It's figuring out, okay, what is the root of that? And then figuring out something healthy to plant in its place. So it just kind of reminds me of that. But
often that need is intimacy. I just want to throw that out there, for those of you who are thinking about this, intimacy, closeness with another human, and guys are definitely lacking that, I think, in general in our society. People are, but certainly guys.
Yeah.
And for husbands listening, that's not just sexual intimacy.
Right.
There's more than friendship. One form of intimacy.
Right.
There's more than one form.
That's friendship. That's hugs. That's just, little touches with somebody who, whether it's your partner or even a sibling or a child, those, snuggles with your kids or whatever. I mean, all that stuff, or even emotional intimacy, just feeling supported by other people, feeling like having people ask, hey, how's it going? Let me follow up with you on that thing that you were having a hard time with, that you were stressed out about the other day. How did that turn out? Right. That's intimacy too.
Yeah. And Kelsey, I love the weed analogy. Probably because like a month ago, I was up visiting my parents in Ann Arbor, and my mom had this hideous weed that was growing in her front garden. It was like 8 or 10 feet tall. Like this thing was just huge, right? It was a miniature tree at this point. And she's like, I really want that gone. And like my nephews were coming over. They're like 10. She's like, I'm going to have them take. I'm like, they're not taking. I'm like, they'll cut it down, but they're not going to get the root out. Right. And so like I spent hours out there digging, and I must have dug like 7-8 feet down to get this root out. But it's like you got to a certain point where it's like, as a man, you're like, I've come this far. And I don't know how much longer it is. Like, it might be another inch. It might be 3 more feet. Like, I don't know how much further, but like, I'm getting this thing.
I will not rest until this weed is destroyed.
I will not be able to sleep tonight until I handle this thing, right?
Yeah.
Without destroying all of my mom's plants around it.
Landscaping,
right? But it's like, hey, you have to approach it in that way sometimes. Of like, hey, I need to figure out what is causing this. Because it's not just destroying you. Like, that's the thing. If you're a dad, if you're a husband, it's not just destroying you. It's going to destroy your family if you don't deal with the root of the issue. And, like we've talked about generational curses and generational blessings on this. And it's like the sins of the son or the sins of the father. It's like you don't need to pass these things down. It's like, I don't know how many guys I've talked to and interviewed that, they say like my porn addiction started when I found my dad's magazines, and it's like, dude, don't let your kids find your phone and you left that website up, like don't pass these things down.
And that's the
deal
reality
with the root of it
too, is that if you don't deal with your own weeds, your weeds grow into other people's lawns. And what that also means is a lot of the weeds that get planted in your life weren't even planted by you. They were planted by your parents. They were planted by people in your family. And so we, a lot of men or just people in general beat themselves up for their weeds and for what's at the root. But a lot of times it's not even stuff you planted. It's what somebody else who didn't deal with their weeds passed that on to you. And so on top of,
I was going to say I think that another way of saying that is my porn addiction started when my great grandfather was molested, before I was born. So, I mean, and then that affected his son. And of course it's not always a paternal kind of a thing, but that generational curse, that is the real deal. And I think that it can come in ways that we don't even realize. Our kids pick up on all kinds of things that we don't think they're picking up on.
Yeah. Oh, they absolutely do. And it might be passed down from generation to generation to generation, but like your generation, if you're listening, like it can stop with your generation. Like that's you can decide to put an end to it. And, like to Kelsey's point, like some of the weeds in your garden might not have been planted by you, and you might never get an apology for those, but you still have to deal with it.
So that
you have to deal with it so that your kids don't have to deal with it.
Yep.
And then they're not going to be needing an apology from you because they could say thank you instead of you having to say sorry.
Yeah.
And I think that's a powerful thing to like parent with that idea of, hey, you know, when my sons are men, when they're full grown men, when my daughters are full grown women, like, what is the story that they're going to be able to tell? It's like, hey, dad dealt with this thing to give me a better life. But that means you have to face it. That means you got to do some digging. That means you have to deal with the root issue, whatever that might be. So I want to wrap this up asking kind of like a 2-in-1 question. Because I think this is relatable for anybody, is if someone listening is directly struggling with it or has a loved one significant to them struggling with mental health in some capacity, whether they are or someone close to them is, like, what's some practical things that they can do? Let's start with if they're the ones, if the listener is the one struggling with mental health in some capacity, what are some practical things that they can do starting today?
Well, like anything, admitting that you have a problem is half the battle. So really, like I keep saying, I like that metaphor of bringing it out into the light and being honest with yourself. Certainly, that might be the biggest and most important thing. But also, I would say with at least one other person, whether that's a trusted friend or family member or a professional, about um, this is a problem for me, and I'm not going to avoid it or deny it. I'm going to call it what it is so that we can deal with it, so that we can analyze where is this coming from and what is this trying to tell me. So that would probably be the biggest thing. Another thing would be to consider, where can I get some help with this? And again, you know, man, woman, whatever, it doesn't matter. That accepting the fact that we need one another, we need to rely on each other, and there are people in your life who need you, and you need other people. And so asking, who can I go to for some support with this, whether it is a therapist or a pastor or my dad or my mom or, you know, whatever, where can I start? Who's one person I can start with?
Yeah. It's funny, as we've started going with our podcast, I think I'm almost more of an advocate for therapy than Wes is sometimes. And not to say that Wesley is anti-therapy, obviously he's not, but like
No,
Wes is a
yeah.
little bit more tempered, and Autumn and I are like, go to therapy, everybody go to therapy.
Yeah, let's see, what's that term? It's you know, it's a type of bias. You know, I don't want to show that type of bias. It's like, you know, the more people in therapy, the more money I make. But that's not what I'm trying to. That's what
Scrooge
I'm trying to
McDuck
avoid.
over here.
It could
Yeah,
be
exactly.
the male versus female approach as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
through a
that
little
could be
bit,
too.
you know?
It's like, oh, you don't need therapy. Toughen up. No, that's not what I'm
Man
saying.
up, deal with it. The therapist said.
Right. No.
Yeah. But truly, I mean, we
Yeah.
have covered this in our podcast, and actually, we've decided, I mean, I guess I've decided that therapy is an important enough topic, in my understanding, that the first episode we have of every month is a therapy related topic. But I mean, the biggest thing is that I can't remember exactly what the statistic was. Wes shared it in one of our episodes. So, but it's what I think I want to say it's like 75% of people find it to be helpful.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
70,
Between
75.
70 and 80%,
Yeah.
it's effective.
Wow.
Which is just that's, I mean, you don't get medications with that
Right.
effectiveness oftentimes. So yeah,
Right.
absolutely. I mean, there are people out there who have years of training and experience in helping with exactly the kind of thing that you're struggling with. How crazy is it not to tap into that? Even just sitting in a room with somebody and having them focus on you and your stresses and your needs for like an hour without interrupting and say, oh man, that reminds me of what happened to me. Right. That's what happens in our conversations. But just sitting for that long of a time, just focused on your stuff, that in itself can be pretty magic.
Yeah. I think, so going to therapy would be my, my first plug. But I think just spending some time just for some introspection, and for some people that's scary. And for some people, your thought patterns are so self-destructive or so self-deprecating that may not be a healthy place for you. But, you know, asking that question of why do I have this response to that thing? Why do I seem to have this kind of reaction when different things pop up. And that was, one of the biggest things, that helped me finally unearth some of the trauma that I went through. I was having really, really strong reactions. And finally I sat down and I said, why am I feeling this way? And that was when I first allowed myself to recognize the trauma that had happened in my childhood. But for the longest time, I was content with just trying not to feel anxious, trying not to feel anxious. But when I finally took a little bit of time to sit and just be a little bit introspective and say, why is that my reaction? That opened up a lot of avenues for me. And I think understanding yourself better is helpful in just about every facet of your life, but especially in mental health.
I have so many thoughts about what both of you said. I think, like, Kelsey, to your point, like, we don't allow ourselves to be bored ever. And so we don't just sit and reflect on things. And also, as guys, we have a tendency to downplay how bad or how hurtful something that happened to us was. Like, I think of a lot of things in my life that my wife is like, hey, how are you handling that? I was like, I was nothing. She's like, really? Are you sure? Because it kind of seems like a lot of something, but it's like we have a tendency to downplay things that happen to us instead of like admitting like, hey, this happened and that was extremely hurtful. That friend, I thought he was a friend, stabbed me in the back. I really thought I was going to get that promotion and I didn't get it. Whatever it is, it's like, hey, grieving that loss.
Having struggled with pornography for like more than half the years that I've been alive, those who have been struggling for a really long time, like I had, know that it kind of comes and goes in seasons and waves. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier, maybe just depending on what you're going through in life. But whenever I was hiding it and brought it out to somebody else, there was always that sense of relief, always that weight lifted off my shoulders. Although maybe me sharing that isn't that helpful because, of course, the next time I would still be resistant to doing that. But yeah,
I think
there's always resistance because there's shame attached to it.
Yes, that was what I was just going to say. Is maybe one of the first action steps is coming face to face with your shame and releasing it, whatever that can look like. Because I think there is a lot of shame around seeking help for mental health, especially for men. And so that's one of the first things that, like we just talked about, a lot of times the weeds that you're dealing with weren't even planted by you. So you don't need to hold yourself hostage to this shame that's actually just preventing you from getting to a place where you're feeling healthy. And, it's not helpful.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it is, what comes to light can get healed. Absolutely. So if someone listening, maybe they don't feel like they're struggling with a mental health issue right now, but someone significant to them, close to them, a loved one of theirs but isn't getting help. What is something, or maybe they are getting help and they're still struggling. What is something that we can do to support our loved ones around us that are kind of walking through that without just turning into a because we're guys, most people listening to this are guys, like we want to fix things. But what can we do to really encourage and help them?
It's a big task. Honestly, the answer is not an easy one here either, because I think that what people in that situation need, the ones who are struggling with mental health challenges, what they need from the people around them is for the people around them to stick around, I would say, to not disappear, and to check in on them on how it's going, if they have any kind of a trusting relationship, and to not put up with crap if the person is not taking it seriously, and just say, hey, I thought this is what you wanted. Do you want this or not? But then also being there for the chill times. You don't have to laser focus on their mental health problems all the time either. You can also just talk about other things or have fun too. But I would say really all of the above is what somebody needs. If they're only getting somebody who is talking about the easy stuff, that's not a very helpful person. If they're only getting someone who will only talk about the hard stuff and the struggles, that's not necessarily somebody who they're going to want to hang out with long term either. So they need you to kind of be all of the above to the extent that you can be while you're still taking care of yourself. And of course, the more people who are involved in their life, supporting them in these ways, the easier the task becomes. Sometimes I'll have clients tell me something, and they'll say, nobody else in my life knows about this. I've never shared this with anybody else before. And what I tell them is, I'm honored and I'm so proud of you for sharing that. But long term, the goal is to bring other people into this, because I'm very uncomfortable, even as a therapist, being the only other one who knows. We need to bring other people into this.
That's so powerful.
I think two of the biggest factors for people who were the most helpful for me in my mental health struggles, especially in the thick of it, were the people who were consistent and reliable and gentle, to be honest. There's a little bit of a line that you have to walk where you don't want to just completely never bring it up kind of gentleness. But there were some times where people just thought like for instance, I've struggled with some phobias, and people were like, "Oh, you have this phobia? Well, I'll make you face your fear right now." I was like, "No, that's not how this works." But people who were gentle enough to help me set my own pace, because that's the reality is you can't make people's choices for them, and you can't set other people's mental health path for them either. Your job is to walk alongside them, however slow that might be. And it's frustrating. So the other piece of it is I definitely suggest to people who have somebody in their life who has a mental health struggle, especially somebody who's resistant to getting help, is get support yourself.
Yes.
It's any type of caretaking position is difficult. Even being close friends with somebody who's struggling with something and is just having some resistance, or is, taking a long time getting to that finish line. It's hard. It's not just hard on them. And I promise you, that's the other thing is trying to renew that compassion as much, because it can get easy when that road gets long and it gets frustrating and you feel like you're going one step forward, two steps back. It's hard. It gets frustrating, but that's why, you need support for yourself in a place where you can talk through your own frustrations as being, affected by it. And then you can kind of renew your compassion to help walk alongside them. Because I promise you, nobody beat me up more about my anxiety than I did. And I know there were times where my anxiety drove some of my friends crazy. I promise you, it was driving me 30 times crazier than it was driving them.
Yeah.
And so it's not, it's not a character flaw. It's just a lot of times a wound or an unmet need, and it takes time to dig to that root sometimes. And so, yeah.
I have one more thing I want to add to that for people who are trying to support someone who's hurting. And that is to just really highlight one thing that Kelsey said, that you do not have control over them. They may not be ready to start seeking help, and there might be very little that you can do about it. And so I would encourage you to make a sincere effort to be there for them, to address the issue, to call it out in a tender way, and to let them know that you're here for them. But then also to understand that it is very common for people to need to hit rock bottom, whatever that looks like for them. Rock bottom looks different from one person to the next, but it's very common for someone to need to hit rock bottom before they're ready to make a change. That's just the reality of it. For many people out there, nothing will get them to start changing until they have lost enough. And that's sad. It's really hard to watch somebody go through that. But I think that for your own well-being, and so that you're ready if and when that time comes, know when to let them do their thing, know when to let them go on the path they're choosing to go on, that nobody can take them off of. And again, be there, be around, let them know that you're there, show them in little ways that you still care about them, so that if and when that happens, they know that they have someone in their life who they can turn to. But if you keep on pursuing that, you keep on harping on it all the time, not only is that wrecking your mental health needlessly, like you're just kind of running on a hamster wheel, you're not making any progress, but that might also make you less likely to be that person for them later on, because you were just kind of nagging them about it all the time, and they don't want to go to a nagger. So it's good to know when to give someone the space they need, even if it's not what's best for them.
Yeah. Setting
Mm.
healthy boundaries, I think.
Mhm.
Because I think a lot of times people tend to get into codependency type relationships too, and they can't set healthy boundaries.
Mm.
Boundaries
Yeah.
was the word that came up to my
Yeah.
mind
I
when
need
Wes
you
was
to need
talking.
me.
Yeah.
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 And unless you're a trained therapist, you are not a trained therapist.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, it's great to be able to vent to a friend over a cup of coffee, but it's like, hey, ultimately, a lot of times, and I even, as a pastor for 8 years, I also had to know when it was like, okay, sometimes people are coming to talk to their pastor or their youth pastor, but there's also times where it's like, hey, this is above my training level, and like I am not equipped to be able to help you in the way that you need help right now. And I love what Kelsey said, like be consistent, be reliable, be gentle, but also know like, hey, some things you're just not trained and equipped for, and that's okay. There's another person that can join their team that can help them in that way. But hey, what can you still do? You can still be consistent and reliable and gentle with them.
Mhm.
Even if you don't have all the answers to their question, you can still continue to show up for them without trying to fix them. Um,
Yeah.
well, hey,
They might exactly need somebody in their life who is willing to admit that they don't have all the answers. That might be what they need.
there is something about that too. There's absolutely something about that. Um, well, Kelsey, Wes, thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your recording schedule to hop on to Kicks and Minivans, talk about this. We are going to be talking about it a lot this season, and so love the perspective and the insight that you guys brought to the table today. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that episode and that conversation, but even more than that, I hope that you gained a lot of wisdom, a lot of practical life things to try to put into motion to get yourself to the healthiest place you could be, or ways that you can help the others around you get to a healthier place. And so I think that's really what it's all about, is that we want to be the best we can for our families so we can help our families be the best that they can be as well. Well, like I said, we have been in some heavy topics the last couple episodes, and we got another one coming up next episode, and then we are scheduled to have an episode release on Valentine's Day, and I'm promising y'all, in a marriage on a podcast on marriage and parenting, we're going to keep that one lighthearted, a little bit fluffier, because I need a break from doing all that too. So, but hey, I hope that this has been meaningful and impactful in your life, in your marriages, in your family, in your homes. So until next time, take care of yourself, take care of your family. This is Kicks and Minivans.